Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva is in China as he aims to bolster economic ties with Brazil's largest trading partner. He arrived in Shanghai on a 4-day state visit Wednesday. The Brazilian delegation includes businessmen, state governors, congressmen, and ministers who are expected to sign over 20 bilateral agreements with China. Lula will hold a high-level meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping on Friday. Rorry Daniels joins me now with more. She's the managing director of the Asia Society Policy Institute. Thanks so much for talking with us. We appreciate it. Can you tell us, first of all, how much of this visit is about business and trade ties, and how much is about repairing relationships damaged under Lula's predecessor, Jair Bolsonaro?
Well, thanks for the question. I mean, in my mind, it's not a binary choice. It's both about restoring relations after the Bolsonaro administration was harshly critical of China, particularly on the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also on China's potential surveillance of the 5G networks that it builds overseas. And so it's really interesting for me to see that one of Lula's first stops was actually at a Huawei factory, which manufactures this 5G equipment. So it shows me that, to the current Brazilian administration, they've very much assessed that the benefits of trade and investment with China do outweigh the risks at this time.
Yeah, Huawei was something that was certainly criticized by Bolsonaro. Brazil's leader is hoping to convince China's president to form a group of nations to mediate an end to Russia's war in Ukraine. What do you expect might come from those talks?
Well, I think it's critically important that the Brazilian leader does communicate a sense of urgency to China to play a more active role in ending the war in Ukraine. I think that China is quick to dismiss that type of ask when it comes from the US or our European allies, simply because China sees the US and Europe as in a coalition to contain China's rise. Brazil brings a very different perspective. Brazil and China see themselves as leaders of the developing world. They can address the developing world's concerns about the food and energy security crises that have come from the Ukraine war. So I think Brazil brings a different perspective, and perhaps Brazil's added perspective might convince China to do a little bit more in bringing these parties together. What is maybe a little less helpful from the U.S. perspective is Lula's comments to press earlier this month that Ukraine should cede Crimea to Russia as part of the settlement. I do think that China, Brazil, potentially other countries like India have a better role to play as neutral conveners to these peace talks than to suggest settlements before the talks have even begun.
Last week, as you know, it was the French President Emmanuel Macron who met with Xi. This week, it's Brazil's Lula. We've also seen longtime regional rivals, Saudi Arabia and Iran, agree to restore diplomatic missions as part of a deal brokered by China. Does this show China's increasing diplomatic influence?
I think that it shows China on a flurry of diplomatic activity, some of which is just pent up deliverables that China could collect after it had been incredibly domestically focused on its COVID situation and the lockdowns and on its transition of political leadership. China does want to show its own public that it can play a strong and constructive role in global affairs. And some of the, diplomacy that you just mentioned, the Saudi-Iran deal, does help China with that narrative. On the other hand, some of China's diplomatic activities I would not characterize as, wins. For example, Xi's trip to Moscow was incredibly disappointing, I think, from a European perspective. And Macron's visit has been heavily criticized back home in Europe. So in some ways, it might have even hardened some anti-China sentiment. So it's a very mixed picture. Diplomacy as events can't paper over some of the major differences that the US and Europe have on one side and China has on the other. That's going to take a little bit more sustained diplomatic engagement and more time.
One of the words we kept hearing in the last couple of weeks in those meetings was multipolar. Rorry Daniels, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.